After the retirement of Joe Namath, the Jets found themselves without much of an identity. So in 1977, they hired Walt Michaels as head coach. Now, Michaels was a Jets assistant. He had come to become head coach after the disastrous Lou Holtz era. Holtz was a very popular college coach who only lasted 11 games with the New York Jets in 1976. And with Michaels, the Jets got off to a bad start in 77. They went 3-11, but 78 and 79, he kind of turns the Jets around. They go 8-8. And as we already talked about on the previous podcast, that the Jets went the entire decade of the 70s without a winning record. Well, Michaels actually gets the AFC Head Coach of the Year in 78 because of that turnaround, taking a 3-11 team and getting them to 8-8. And in 79, the same 8-8 season. So entering the decade of the 1980s, the Jets were looked at as an up-and-coming team. And not only was Michaels a pretty good coach, but he also drafted very well. You had names such as Joe Klecko, Greg Buttle, Mark Gastineau, Marvin Powell, Freeman McNeil, Wesley Walker, Lance Mell, Mickey Schuler, Marty Lyons. These were all players that Walt Michaels drafted. So the 1980 season starts, and the Jets didn't do very well. A lot of people were saying that the Jets could be a playoff team. They weren't. Richard Todd, who was the quarterback then, who was drafted in the 70s, but got off to a slow start. He never really found his footing. But 1980, he's given the starting job, has a disastrous season, 17 touchdowns, 30 picks, leads the league. The Jets finished 4-12. So the 81 season comes, and again, the Jets have a lot of young talent, but they hadn't had a winning record since 1969. In 81, it doesn't look very good for them at the very beginning. They start 0-3, and then all of a sudden, they click. And what is born out of that is a great defense that's aggressive and that can get off after the quarterback, called the sack exchange. Now, on that defensive line was Mark Gastineau, Abdul Salam, Joe Klecko, and Marty Lyons. And a sack became an official statistic in 1982, but in 1981, the Jets unofficially collected 66.5 sacks, led by Klecko and Gastineau, who had over 20 each. After getting off to the 0-3 start, the Jets, like I said, just clicked. They wound up finishing the season at 10-5-1. One of the great games of that year involved a Richard Todd comeback against the Dolphins, where they scored with under 20 seconds left to beat them 16-15, and that kind of gave Todd that what he was missing, which was the ability to take the Jets down the field in the final minutes. Todd had never really done that, and you saw him mature right before your eyes. What was a disastrous 80 season with 17 touchdowns and 30 picks. In 81, he had 25 touchdowns and 13 picks. So the Jets wound up clinching a playoff spot in 81, the first playoff spot since 1969, and they clinched it on the final day of the season at home against the Packers. They tortured poor Lynn Dickey, sacked him like 11 times, and they're able to get into the playoffs. Well, they play the Buffalo Bills in a wild card round at Chase Stadium. Everybody's so excited. The game gets off to a disastrous start as the Jets fall behind 24-0, and throughout the game, the Jets had plenty of chances to get back into it, as the Bills played a very sloppy game as well. They kept turning the ball over, but the Jets just kept shooting themselves in the foot, and even given chance after chance in the first half to cut the deficit, they only cut it to 24-14. 24-13. Then as the fourth quarter starts, the Jets find themselves down 31-13. Looks like the game's over. The Jets then score 2 touchdowns in about a 5-minute span to cut the lead to 31-27. With about a minute and a half, 2 minutes left, the Jets get the ball back. They're driving down the field, a great drive. It looks like that they could go in to potentially win the game, and they just ran out of time. And Todd was intercepted inside the 10-yard line by Bruce Simpson, and the Jets wound up losing 31-27. But again, a great turnaround for the Jets in 81, and everyone was kind of picking them as the team to beat in 1982, a very young and up-and-coming team. Well, in 82, you had the NFL strike, and that reduces the season to just 9 games. Now, for the teams that were off to a good start then, You never want to have a strike interrupt a season when it looks like you're about to have a good season and be one of the better teams in the game. Now, for the New York Jets, in 1982, they lost their season opener against the Miami Dolphins, and then in week 2, they wound up beating the New England Patriots easily 31-7. So at the strike, they are 1-1, and no one still really knows what they're dealing with yet. No NFL teams do. But when the strike ends, it ends in the end of November, and they settle on a 9-game season. So the Jets still have 7 games left to play, and they go on a run. They wind up winning 4 straight games to now stand at 5-1. And they go into Miami after losing to them in week 1. They go into Miami with a chance to solidify their chances to own at least one home playoff game in the AFC. And if possible, they could own home field advantage if they win the rest of their games as well. Well, the NFL playoff structure also changed in 1982 because of the strike. They had no more divisions. They put the AFC and NFC in like one conference. So the AFC as one conference, the NFC as one conference. There were no divisions, and they then took the top 8 teams from each conference as a playoff team. So it's not like the Jets had to win the AFC East because there was no division. So they had that going for them where they could finish in the top 4, get a home playoff game, and if possible, finish in the top 1 or 2 and possibly get the home field advantage throughout the AFC playoffs. But in order to do that, they have to beat the Dolphins, who are 5-1 as well. And they go down to Miami. They're winning the game with about 30 seconds left. The Dolphins at the 50-yard line. David Woodley, their quarterback, throws a pass that's right in the hands of Jets cornerback Bobby Jackson. He drops it. That extends the game. The Dolphins then complete a pass to get them inside of field goal range. And as the buzzer sounds, Uwe von Schaman connects on a 47-yard field goal to give the Dolphins a 19-17 win. That wasn't the best scenario for the Jets, but they still are able to, if they win their last 2 games, be in great position to get at least one home playoff game. They're not going to get the home field advantage now because the Dolphins now had beaten them twice already that year. But what happens, the Jets, going into the final game of the year with a chance to clinch at least a home playoff game, lose to the Chiefs. They finish 6-3, and now they have to go on the road for the entire AFC playoffs. They immediately have to play a tough game in a wild card round because they're playing the defending AFC champion Cincinnati Bengals, who were still very good. Well, they go into Cincinnati and they destroy the Bengals 44-17. Then the next week they go out to Los Angeles. Now the Raiders were 7-2. They finished behind the Dolphins with the second best record in the AFC. And the Raiders were very intimidating. They were very tough. And not many people thought the Jets were an intimidating team or a tough team. They thought the Jets were kind of soft, built on speed, and didn't really have a lot of, grit and toughness. But anyway, the Jets play a very physical game. They, so many big hits. I remember Kirk Springs just leveling Cliff Branch on one play and getting an interception. And the Jets wound up beating the Raiders 17-14, and what I think was a shock to most people, and even for the Jets, kind of showed the NFL that this was a team that was really starting to gel and come of age. And if there's one thing that people question about the Jets, it was their toughness. But beating the Raiders, they were able to show the NFL that they really were a tough team. Well, now they get a chance at revenge in playing the Miami Dolphins. However, the Jets were built on speed. Freeman, McNeil, Wesley Walker, Bruce Harper, they had a lot of guys who were very fast. Even on defense, Mark Gastineau, Joe Klecko, they got after the quarterbacks. The Dolphins knew this. And the week of the game, they had a lot of torrential downpours in Miami. The Dolphins didn't cover the field, and what should have been a dry, perfect field to play on is a quagmire. And there's mud all over the place. They coined that game the Mud Bowl, as it really should have never been played. But at this point, what are you going to do? You have to play the game. Don Shula was on the rules committee, so it's not like they were going to give him a penalty and say you can't play the game. in my opinion, the whole thing was a conspiracy, and Shula knew exactly what he was doing. The Dolphins knew exactly what they were doing. They didn't want the Jets to have that speed advantage. And anyway, the game turned out to be one of the worst in Jet history. Richard Todd, who was coming of age and had such a good season in 81 and 82, kind of falls right back into the old Richard Todd of 1980, throws 5 interceptions, and that really was the end of his successful Jets career, as the Jets wound up losing that game 14-0. The Dolphins go on to the Super Bowl and lose to the Redskins, and many people still think that that Jet team would have been able to beat the Redskins because they were a very fast team. They had so many weapons, and I think on a dry field, all things considered, we're a better team than the Dolphins. But it is what it is. The Jets wound up losing. But still, you thought that this team had a lot to look forward to. They still had a lot of young players. They drafted well. They had set themselves up pretty good for the next couple seasons. And they had a very good coach in Walt Michaels. However, on the plane ride home, I don't really want to speculate. I don't know exactly what happened, but things were said. Michaels wound up saying some things, and he gets fired as the head coach. And who replaced him was Joe Walton, who was a popular offensive coordinator, and many people didn't think that the Jets were really going to miss that much with Walton as head coach. Now, joining us, we have Chris Fallica. Now, you know Chris from ESPN College Gameday. Chris, one of the smartest people I know. He knows Jets and Jets history very well. And Chris is going to talk to us today about his thoughts on the Walt Michaels era. Chris, how you doing today, bud?
I'm doing well. It knows New York Jet history. I think anybody who sees the lack of hair on the top of my head and knows the amount of Tums and Rolaids I've consumed in the past would certainly would realize how much of a Jets follower. I mean, gosh, you know, my dad and I, we had season tickets at Old Shea Stadium from '78 on, and then finally gave up the season tickets when my dad got fortunately sick, and then got to go to the new stadium with all PSL. That was a ridiculous thing. It didn't make it worth it. But, yeah, we go back to 142J at Shea back in 78. I still remember the first game I went to. I think it was a Dolphins 33, Jets 20. And I think was the opening day for that game back in 1978, if I remember correctly.
Wow. And we talk about 78. It's perfect how I got to lead it.
You're going to have to check me on that, too, by the way. And you can call me out, whether we're still on the air or not. You can call me out whether I'm right or wrong.
Okay. Well, I mean, either way, it's a perfect lead-in because I was going to start with the Walt Michaels era. And kind of that was how the Jets started to turn things a little bit. With how Michaels drafted. He drafted Clunko, drafted Lance Mel, drafted Missy Schuler, Freeman McNeil, Wesley Walker. What do you think went wrong with the Michaels era? They had the playoff game and a loss to Buffalo. Then you had the whole debacle in Miami. But then he got fired. Do you think that was a mistake for them?
I think it was a mistake for them, and depending on who you listen to and who you believe and what you believe, it was either Michaels himself or I know there's definitely some feelings that Joe Walton kind of went through some backdoor channels to maybe cast Michaels in a bad light and give himself the job. I really was unfortunate because they were a very successful team under Walt Michaels. I mean, that wild card game that they lost to Shea against Buffalo was an unbelievable comeback where they nearly pulled it off with the Simpson interception inside the 10-yard line.
Oh yeah.
I mean, and then they were highly thought of the year of the strike, and then they kind of 6-3 in that strike season and getting in and then beating the Bengals, beating the Raiders, and then unfortunately Don Shula and the Dolphins didn't cover the Orange Bowl field, let it be a monsoon because they knew that Freeman McNeil was going to run all over them. Yeah. And that game unfortunately changed Richard Todd forever. Right. And I think he was spooked by that, and I think that maybe had a lot to do with the changes that took place after that as well. But I mean, even Walton. I mean, they started 10-1. Right. In '86 under him. It's not like they didn't have Jets under him. They had a ton of players, and we can go down the list of every game that went wrong for them, and every whether it's the game in Cleveland or getting blown out in wild card games and whatever else. But it's certainly it's a shame because they were they were a very deserving team the year of the strike, and I think they would have had a great chance to beat the Redskins in the Super Bowl that year.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, the whole thing with the tarp is something that, don't get me started on. I thought that was a whole conspiracy. But,
I think it was, it may have been, and you may know the answer, it might have been the Gangrene book that I think it was written by Joe Fields.
Yes, I remember reading that, yep.
I think he has an anecdote in there about, like, they getting to Miami and they saw the field and there were some Dolphin staffers like laughing at the fact that the field wasn't covered.
Right.
I could be imagining that, but it seems to stick in the back of my head that there was some anecdote in there about when the Jets got there and saw the field. It was like, you got to be kidding me.
Exactly.
And then like the Dolphin staffers, like, oh yeah, we gotcha.
But yeah, you got it right. 33-20, the season opener in 1978, hit it right on the head. There you go.
I'm displaying my age.
Yeah, I think most Jet fans will look at that event, that game in Miami, as less than kosher as far as everything that broke down with the tarp and their explanation for it. Nonetheless, it was what it was. The Jets wound up losing that game. From that, with the firing of Walt Michaels, we are introduced to a new head coach in Joe Walton. When we come back, we will enter the Joe Walton era here on Hit the Mark.